So hey everyone, my name is Jen. Back here again today for another At Home with Nature video. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that's really interesting to me, really exciting kind of line of work to be in, and that is native bees. So I think when a lot of us think of bees, we picture the honeybee buzzing around the hive, working really hard to protect the queen, producing lots of honey. And I think that kind of image, sticks with people. But it's interesting to know that honeybees are actually not native to Canada. They were brought over from Europe for the purpose of making honey. And in fact, there are over 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and more species are being discovered each and every single day in different parts of the world. So with that, in Canada, there's around 800 species in Canada, and about 400 or so in Ontario and the GTA. So that is an incredible diversity of bees that we have right here in our own backyards in some cases. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about some of those bee species that maybe just don't get quite as much attention as our native, or as the honeybee. I also have some really cool specimens I want to show folks. So there is going to be a little bit of an awkward transition time at one point while I get my camera set up. So just prepared for that. But first we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the bees that you might find nearby. Feel free to use the comments for any questions or comments or anything like that. I'll try to get to as many comments as I can. So before we get started, let's think of some kind of characteristic features that a bee might have. So when we think of bees, what do we think of? For me, I think an easy one that comes to mind is that a lot of people assume that all bees are black and yellow. Which is true. There's a ton of different bee species that are black and yellow, but native bees can really vary in color. They can be anywhere from, red to blue to metallic green. So there is a huge range of colors and patterns that bees come in. So I think a lot of times, often people will see a bee and they mistake it for something else, such as a fly. There is one easy way to tell a bee apart from a fly, and that is to look at their wings first. So flies they are part of the Diptera class of bugs. So if you break that down, 2, so that means they have 2 wings, 1 on each side. Bees have 4 wings, so they'll have a pair, kind of 2 wings on both sides for 4 total. So that's one giveaway. The antenna is another one. So bees tend to have pretty long antennae, where flies tend to have much shorter, smaller antennae. And then the eyes is kind of the third really good giveaway. So bees tend to have smaller eyes compared to flies. Flies' eyes often touch, where bees typically have a bit more of a separation. So what are some other things that we think of when we think of bees? Maybe that they are fuzzy is probably a good one. So a lot of times, yes, a lot of different bees are really fuzzy and furry. And this is because of, their role in pollination. So because they have all those nice fuzzy hairs either on their legs or on their abdomen, as they go to flower to flower, they're able to pick up things like pollen and nectar. So when we think of bees, we often think of, that fuzzy little bumblebee. But in fact, there are some bees that don't have any hair at all. So this can be kind of tricky when you're trying to identify bees. You might mistake it again as a fly or a wasp. And some bees have some really cool adaptations that they can use to collect things as they go along. There's even some cases where certain bees don't have any fur at all, and they'll actually eat all of that pollen and nectar, and then once they get back to the hive, they'll regurgitate it back up to where they need it. So very cool differences in terms of how bees function. A lot of times we also think of bees living in these really intense social structures in a hive, kind of similar to honeybees, when in fact a huge majority of the bees in Ontario are actually solitary. So they completely nest on their own. Some of them have what we call kind of a communal entrance. So you can kind of think of like an apartment building. So everyone in that apartment building shares the main door, but then everyone else in that apartment has their own space. Bees actually do this as well. So there's certain bees, especially bees that burrow into the ground, they'll share a common entrance and then they'll make their own apartments within that burrow. Now there are some social bees, so things like bumblebees are a good example. But as I said, a lot of the bees in this area are actually solitary. I think one other last thing I think that people probably think about when they think of bees is stinging. So a lot of times, you know, people see a bee, they start to freak out because they think they're going to be stung. When in fact, a lot of our native bees rarely sting. They aren't quite as territorial or as aggressive as things like wasps. So generally they don't always sting. So that's important to remember. If you do see a bee, don't freak out. It's very unlikely that it's going to sting you in order to protect itself. A lot of bees even don't have the stinging capability, especially some of the smaller solitary bees. So there's no reason to get freaked out when you see a bee. Now, a lot of times people are worried about wasps because wasps can be a little bit more aggressive. They can be a little bit more territorial. They also tend to bug us a lot in the summertime just because they will eat things like meats and fruits. So that's why you see them kind of buzzing around parks or maybe at your picnic table. Whereas bees only feed on nectar. They won't come after all of that delicious food on your table. So it's probably wasps that you're actually dealing with. Awesome. So I don't think we see any other comments coming through, just that someone loves bees. I love that. That's awesome. So just kind of the point for this first little bit is that bees come in so many different sizes, shapes, colors. It's really, really exciting to explore all of these different species that you can find around. It's a bit windy today, so I don't have a ton of bees visiting my flowers. But hopefully we'll be able to see some of my specimens. I will say, if you are interested in learning more about bees, the City of Toronto's Biodiversity series has an entire book all about different bees in the GTA. Now, as I mentioned, there's over 400 or close to 400 species in the GTA alone. So obviously they don't cover every single species. Some of the species are hard to ID as well, so but this is just a good starting point for anyone that's interested. I just wanted to show an image too of some of our little solitary nesting. So it goes over things like nesting behavior. I don't know if you can see that. So these are little solitary. So this would be an example of a ground nesting structure where they will actually burrow into the ground and lay their eggs underground. And this would be an example of kind of like a hollowed out stem or maybe a piece of wood where they'll actually pack in their little babies or their eggs, wrap it in lots of food, and then essentially the larva just eats their way out. So really cool information in this book if you are interested. Ooh, somebody asked, I heard there is a bee of Toronto. Yes, there is an unofficial bee of Toronto. I'll show a picture because I actually don't have a specimen of it. The unofficial bee of Toronto is a sweat bee. Which page is it on? So it's this little guy here. Let's see if I can get it up there. So really cool metallic green. I do have some sweat bees that I'm going to show, but I don't have this one in particular. It has a really long, complicated name. Tricolored. I'll let you guys Google that after. But that is our unofficial bee of Toronto. So that's because they're found pretty much everywhere. They're very bright and easy to identify when you see them. And the reason that they're called a sweat bee is because they actually feed on your sweat. So if you see kind of little bugs buzzing around you, it's actually just because they want to get some of the minerals and some of the sugars and stuff that's coming out in your sweat. So that's a great question. Awesome. So as I mentioned, I have some really fun specimens to show you, just a couple to go over. But before I kind of start to set up my camera and there's a bit of a bumpy ride, can anyone guess how many bee species bee families are in the GTA? So we have around 400 species or so. How many families? So sorry, this is going to be a bumpy ride, but we're going to move over now. And I just have to flip my camera. Oops. Okay. And I have one more little jump around. I have to just throw on, I have a little macro lens with me today that I'm gonna clip on. So we've got some guesses coming in. I see Steph says 5. Sorry, let me just get this lens all figured out. There we go. So the answer is actually 6. We have 6 bee families in the GTA. Sorry, the sun has changed a little bit here for me, so I'm just going to turn up my light. So I have just a few examples of some of the bees that you can find, and I see that someone says bumblebees, so we're going to start with the bumblebee because that's one of my favorites as well. Let's get this guy in there. So here's our little bumblebee. Bumblebees are incredibly cute, very easy to identify just because of how fuzzy they are. They're often, in fact, one of the first bee species to emerge in the spring. Oops, sorry, I need to get a better angle. There we go. Just because they are so fuzzy. So all of that extra fuzz, it keeps them warm in the spring. So where other bees would probably not be able to survive, our bumblebee here is so nice and cozy warm that it can emerge a bit earlier in the spring. So our bumblebees are really why it's super important to have lots of different flowers available kind of in that early spring. Awesome. Oops. There we go. Okay, so another bee species that I have here. Do this one next. This one is our longhorn bee. One species of longhorn bee at least. You can see it's really long antennas. What I like about this specimen is it really shows off its pollen collecting action here. So you can kind of see, yeah, this might actually be better without my lens. There we go. So you can see kind of the little satchel that it has on the side of its legs here. This is what it's going to be using to actually collect some of its pollen. Very cute little bee. Ooh, somebody asked, are bumblebees social or solitary? Bumblebees are one of our social ones. So they will have a queen and they will have a little hive. But instead of using a hive, they'll actually nest underground. So they burrow. Now this one is a really cool bee. Do we have any guesses of what this is? Really big bee. And so this one here is actually what we call a carpenter bee. So this one in particular is the Virginia carpenter. They look somewhat similar to bumblebees just in their size, and they do have a little bit of fuzziness, but they have this really shiny kind of back end of their body, and that's usually how you can tell them apart. They also have these incredibly powerful mouthpieces, which just allows them to actually drill into wood. So they're able to take, you know, maybe in your deck or on your fence, and actually able to make themselves little corridors to put their eggs. So very powerful bee. These ones sometimes seem more aggressive just because they're very territorial, and they're very big, so they buzz loudly. So sometimes what will happen is if you get too close to the nest, the male will come out and just kind of remind you to stay away. So it's not that these guys are going to come sting you, it's just that they want to make sure that their homes are safe, because if you can imagine being a little tiny bee like this, drilling into wood is incredibly labor intensive, so they want to protect that as best they can. Alrighty, so let's look at maybe just 2 more bees before we wrap up. Alright, this little one here, it's kind of hard to see this one. This one's really tiny. This is kind of a good example of one of the ones that I was saying that does not have a whole lot of fuzziness to it. So it looks quite smooth and sleek. Some people might confuse this for something like a wasp, but this is what we call a resin bee. So resin bees will, go around collecting pollens and nectars, kind of similar to our other bees, but they'll then create these kind of resin-like structures for their nests. So that's our resin bee. One of them at least. There's quite a few resin bees. The last one we're going to look at, I've got 2 of them. So this is not Toronto's official sweat bee, but they are 2 really nice samples of sweat bees. So this is just a really great example of some of the colors that we can see in some of our bee species. So amazing, really metallic green colored bee here. Let me just give it a second to focus in. There we go. So this one has, these are 2 different species. I'm not sure which one is which, because again, identifying bees it's actually pretty difficult if you don't have the experience or just kind of, things like microscopes available. But just incredible colors of blues and greens throughout these bees. So gorgeous. So these are both sweat bees. Really cool looking bee. Awesome. So I'll just put that down there, and I'll take it's all right. Now I'm trying to get my phone out. Give me another bumpy ride. See if we can see. I did have some sweat bees on my flowers earlier, but again, it's a little windy today. So sometimes bees tend to stay kind of hidden on a windy day just because it's too much work for them to fly around. No, I'm not seeing them now, but definitely I encourage folks to go out into your gardens. Take a look, see if you can see any of these little tiny sweat bees flying around. No, they seem to be, I think, taking a break for the day. There were quite a few on my pepper plants earlier, but I don't see them now. Awesome. All right, so does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? I didn't see too many come through. Awesome. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more, we've put a link to the City of Toronto book just in the comments. We also have a gardening fact sheet for bees. So if you're interested in adding more bees to your yard, or inviting more bees to your yard, I should say, definitely check that out. It's got a lot of great references in terms of what you should be planting, and what kind of habits are just gonna kind of encourage bees for stopping by. So I don't see any more questions. It's getting very hot because I think it's about to rain. So I'm going to wrap things up. But thanks everyone. Have a great day.